chapter 35, section 1. So by the time you get to 1799, there's been revolution and war going on in France for a decade, for 10 years. The people were ready for peace. The people were ready for order, but they needed a strong leader to get that done. And that leader is going to be Napoleon. He's going to change not only France, but all of Europe. So let's give a little background on Napoleon. So Napoleon came to France from Corsica, which is an island down there in the Mediterranean. Sometimes he was even referred to as the Little Corsican. It's reported that he was 5'2" tall, although there's conflicting reports about that. But he worked hard. He only slept 3 hours a night. He ate while dictating speeches to his secretaries. He was a lieutenant in the French army. And by the time he's 24, he's become a general in the French army. But he's not satisfied. He wants more power. In 1796, Napoleon is going to lead the French into Italy to defeat Austria. And France is going to gain Belgium from Austria. And in turn, France is going to gain hundreds of pieces of art, and they're going to put them in the Louvre. The Louvre is the French National Museum in Paris. In 1798, Napoleon is going to attack Britain in Egypt. And Napoleon wins a great land victory. But the French fleet was destroyed. But France is able to establish influence in Egypt. It's also here where they discover the Rosetta Stone. The Rosetta Stone is the reason why we can read hieroglyphics, ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. It has the same passage written in multiple languages that we already knew. While in Egypt, though, Austria, Great Britain, and France are going to Austria, Great Britain, and Russia are going to defeat France in Europe. So Napoleon hurries back to Paris. And he is going to conspire with 2 members of the Directory to take over the government in France. So on November 9th of 1799, Napoleon overthrows the government in France. And Napoleon is going to set up a new government called the Consulate. And Napoleon is going to be the head of this new government. So he would be the first consul. And now that he has control, Napoleon's going to take care of the enemies of France. So remember, we said Russia and we said Austria and Great Britain had attacked France. So by this time here, Russia was no longer at war with France, so he didn't have to worry about them. He defeats Austria in 1801, and he defeats Great Britain, signs a peace treaty with Great Britain in 1802. So the fighting's over. So that was one of his big things, is defeat those French enemies, make France not be at war anymore. So back at home in France, that government of Napoleon's, a directory, um, it it had been broke and weak, and Napoleon wanted to make his government that he created, the consulate, he wanted to make it strong and rich. But to do that, he's got to change the way things are done. Um, he's going to have the national government can choose local officials, and the national government can collect taxes. Um, the national government's more organized. It's easier for them to collect taxes than all these independent little local governments. Um, so they're going to collect more taxes that they should have been owed anyway. And the national government's helping choose those local officials. The economy starts getting better. The debts that France had start getting paid. You're also going to see a public education system set up. The legal system is going to be organized. Before Napoleon, different parts of the country had different laws. And Napoleon is going to appoint a committee of lawyers that will write a new code of laws. And the code will be divided into 5 parts. And this code of law is going to be called the Napoleonic Code. So that way, everywhere in France had the same laws. He wanted to preserve in this the rights that were won in that French Revolution. So you saw things like, serfdom ends. There is no more serfs. Nobody belongs to the land. People will be equal before the law. A guaranteed public trial by jury, freedom of religion. Some of these ideas that had been won during the French Revolution, he keeps them. But some ideas are lost. For example, you can't criticize the national government, meaning you don't have freedom of speech. You don't have freedom of press. And he had police forces that would jail people that were suspected of being against Napoleon. Back at home, Napoleon tried to make Paris and France itself more beautiful. Something big that he had built in Paris was the Arc de Triomphe. It's this huge marble arch. It's the monuments to his successful military campaigns. Napoleon is going to hire Jacques Louis David as the court painter. He also designed furniture. And the furniture he designed, it was made to look like it was from ancient Greece and Rome, even though it wasn't. This is going to be referred to as the Empire style. And it's going to spread throughout Europe. It affected people's clothing styles, their hairstyles. Really, they're almost mocking ancient Greece and Rome. Under Napoleon, you're going to see transportation improved. He has roads get improved, digs canals, has 14 new bridges across the Seine River in Paris. Okay, transportation gets better. You had more ways in Paris to get across the river. Napoleon was very popular. I mean, he brought peace, he brought order, he was making things better. And in 1802, he asks to be elected first consul for life. And the plebiscite vote, the people vote. This is the popular vote. And they elect him first consul for life. In 1804, Napoleon becomes the Emperor of France. And the coronation will be held in the Notre Dame Cathedral there in Paris. And even the Pope came. The Pope came to crown Napoleon emperor. The Pope didn't get the chance because Napoleon took the crown from the Pope and placed it on his own head. He crowned himself emperor. Napoleon wasn't happy with just being emperor of France, though. He wanted to form a grand empire, replacing that old Holy Roman Empire of before. Napoleon had a good army. He had excellent soldiers, and they worshipped him as emperor. And he had officers that were good in battle, not just, oh, you're upper class, you get to be an officer. They were good in battle. In 1803, Great Britain declares war on France. They felt threatened by Napoleon, but they were unable to stop Napoleon. In 1805, Napoleon crowned himself King of Italy. In 1806, he formed the Confederation of the Rhine, which is a small group of German states. And then 2 years later, he invades Spain and Portugal. And then in 1809, he made the Papal States part of France. Actually put the Pope in jail. Napoleon and France now controlled much of Europe. Conquered countries were strongly influenced by France. French citizens controlled the governments of these other places. Some of them were even, Napoleon's own relatives. This Napoleonic code that he had was made law across Europe. And it's going to spread some of those ideas of that French Revolution. But Napoleon still hadn't conquered Great Britain and France. Everything else in green he had basically taken. In Britain, their navy was too strong. And to get to Britain, you need a navy because it's an island. Napoleon tries a different strategy to try to take Britain. He actually forbade anywhere under his control from trading with Great Britain. But that's hard to enforce. It fails. People still were doing business with Britain. He's going to try a different strategy with Russia, though. With Russia, Napoleon organizes the Grand Army, 600,000 soldiers. This was the largest army in the world to this point. And in the summer of 1812, the Grand Army is going to invade Russia. The Russians actually only spent one battle fighting. The rest of the time, the Russians were retreating. So they fought one battle, and the rest of the time, they're running away. And as they run away, they burn villages, and they burn food, and they burn fields as they retreat. This is called the scorched earth policy. When they had to leave an area, when the Russians had to retreat, if they had left anything there, that means the French could have used it. And so they used a scorched earth policy to make sure there's nothing left for the French. By the time you get to September, Napoleon has reached Moscow. But the Russians had abandoned Moscow. And Moscow had actually caught fire. 3/4 of it burned. But what this means is the French had no food and the French had no shelter. Napoleon tried to send peace agreements to Russia, but the Russians ignored him. And Napoleon's going to have to order a withdrawal. Because you see, winter had begun. You had temperatures of 40 degrees below zero. Hundreds of thousands of French froze to death. Thousands more died from disease and starvation. Fewer than 100,000 of his troops made it back to France. So, did the Russians defeat Napoleon? I would argue no. Winter did. Mother Nature defeated Napoleon. Napoleon's going to quickly raise another army. But there's the problem. He quickly raised another army. They're not nearly as well trained as his previous army, as the Grand Army was. And Austria, Prussia, Russia, and Great Britain, they joined together for the first time. For the first time, they joined together. They have a common enemy here in Napoleon, and they're going to defeat Napoleon. They defeated Napoleon. In 1814, these allied nations are going to take Paris. And Napoleon is going to be forced to abdicate, meaning he had to give up the throne. And he was going to be sent into exile on the little small island of Elba. Okay? The little small island of Elba there off the coast of Italy. So he is sent into exile on Elba. Thing is, Napoleon will eventually escape Elba, and he gathers together troops to invade France, to try to take it back. And he is going to become emperor of France again for 100 days. For 100 days, until the Duke of Wellington, who was the British leader of the Allied forces, is going to defeat Napoleon once and for all at the Battle of Waterloo. And this time, Napoleon will be sent away to be exiled on St. Helena, off the coast of West Africa, where he will eventually die in 1821.